Hey guys, I'm Jeff with Two Moose Design, and in today's video, we're going to replace these counter height chairs with some fresh custom ones. We got these things online a while back, and they've just seen their days. They're literally falling apart and holding on for dear life. I've even tried to weld them a few times, but it's time to move on. We found some pretty cool ones online that are like $1,000 plus each, which is just outside of our budget for 2 new chairs. So I don't have a bunch of money, but we have a bunch of tools, so let's head out to the shop and try to make them ourselves.
We're going to start out by making the skeleton, since this kind of wraps the entire chair together, and I doubt you want to watch me cut all these pieces, so we're just going to skip that part. And after I got them cut, I went ahead and just cleaned them all up and tapered all the edges so I can get a nice clean weld. And these look pretty simple, but my angles kind of got to be spot on or the legs will all splay out weird, because a few degrees off will really amplify to the bottom of the leg. I really should have made like a little jig fixture to kind of put these together so that they were identical, but I figured by the time I do that I could have these both complete, which is kind of why I ran into a few problems later on. This bench is not flat. I got it for a steal on Marketplace, but as soon as I saw it I realized why it was so cheap. But I took it anyways because I didn't have a good bench, so keeping everything flat's a little bit of a challenge, and that's one of the biggest struggles with welding, is pumping a bunch of heat into something and it warping on you. And you can see my welding setup's pretty basic, so a jigger fixture would have helped drastically in making both of these pieces identical. They weren't. As you can see, this was my measuring gauge to get the angle right, and they were both off a little. And after I hodgepodged these babies together, I used an angle grinder to clean up as much as I could, and then followed it up with the orbital sander. And now I need to drill holes to create the mounting bracket, as it will be a floating type setup for the seat. I had these little holes for screws to ensure that the legs went back out once they're seated.
So now that these are done, I'm gonna give them a quick touch up with an orbital and then wipe them down with some acetone to get them nice and clean and throw a coat of primer on them so I don't gotta worry about them rusting, and then I don't gotta worry about digging up the paint when I fit the wood to the frames.
Metal is typically coated in grease or oil to ensure it doesn't rust, so you wanna make sure you get all that stuff off. And then I just used the self-etching primer to seal them up. I set this piece aside months ago, but with the shop chaos it gained some clutter around it, so it's finally time to dig this thing out. Then we're going to roughly cut this walnut into more manageable pieces.
This video is sponsored by Diablo, which you can get at Home Depot. I've been using these tools since I started woodworking, and they have been great. From their sandpaper to their saw blades. And the saw blades have a whole bunch of carbide on the teeth, unlike some of the cheaper brands. And we're gonna throw a 90 tooth blade on here to get a nice smooth cut. If you're doing a lot of ripping, I'd probably do a lower tooth count, so it cuts through with a little more ease. But when I add the taper to them chair legs, I want a nice smooth cut.
And obviously we gotta throw a fresh 80 tooth Diablo blade on the miter saw as well. Then we'll be breaking down this big old piece of walnut even further, getting it closer to its desired thickness so it's easier to manage and work with. This Diablo blade zipping through this walnut like butter. And just like that, we have 8 chair legs.
So the skeleton, or frame, is painted, and now I have all my legs cut.
And now we just need to remove a bunch of material so it slides in there nice and even. I made this jig for something else a while back, so we're just going to modify it slightly so I can make these cuts nice and safe. And I'm totally guessing all this. I just want it to go in deep enough so it feels nice and stable. Right about there's good. And now we're just going to keep removing material until this thing fits like a glove inside that skeleton. Just keep inching it closer, one pass at a time. And these clips are sped up. I'm going quite slow while I'm doing this, so don't think I'm just ramming it in there. Just slowly remove material until I get that perfect fit. Still ain't there yet. Eventually I got the pieces to fit in there, and then the inside of the metal is actually rounded, so we're going to use a file to kind of just round out these corners until I can get these pieces in there. Some actually had to sand a little extra to get them to fit good, but they all fit in the end. Slowly but surely these things are coming to life and starting to look like something. After you sketch up enough things, you learn to not exactly trust SketchUp, so I made a few models based on my SketchUp drawing to prototype the actual feel. Just because these measurements look good on paper don't mean they feel good on your back, so don't judge my janky setup.
So I've been prototyping with the back and all that to make sure it's like ergonomically correct. I had Jess and Evie sit on it and got some feedback, and I think we're good. And I made my first mistake.
That's a lie, I made many.
This was my first prototype piece, and I put it on here and I didn't even account for the part that went in to the metal. So I wasted this beautiful piece of walnut, but I'll find a use for it elsewhere. You guys didn't think I was gonna make something without using the CNC, did ya?
Now that the pieces actually feel good on the back, I modeled them in Illustrator to get an SVG so that I could cut them on the CNC. Just like that, 4 perfectly even back pieces. I then followed the same exact steps as I did for the legs to get these to fit into the back part. Other than cutting the legs out of that 8/4 walnut and the backrest, I made most of these pieces out of scraps, so we're doing pretty good on budget.
Alright, so we have the chair backs here, along with the seat bottoms. I 3D modeled all these, and the seat backs will take about 10 minutes each side, I think 10-12 minutes, and then each seat bottom will be dished out in 20 minutes. So we'll get this thing running, then we can move on to the next steps.
This was my first time 3D modeling stuff like this to actually put on the CNC in this like sense of furniture building, so I learned a lot doing this. I think the seat bottoms actually took about 30, but these did take 12 minutes each. And the way these cove and taper, they would have been difficult to cut on the bandsaw. So a little bit of light sanding, a little zing zing from the Diablo, and we have 2 perfect seat backs. And now onto the seat bottoms, or the place for your butt. I don't know what you actually call them. We decided to add a little shape to them just to kind of highlight them a little bit. I didn't want to straight up copy the other people's design, so we kind of played off it the best we could without totally knocking them off. Now these did take just over 30 minutes. I could have let the machine run longer to get rid of some of these sand marks, but I have a Rotex. And 10 minutes with this bad boy and these things were smooth as could be.
Alright, so they're coming together. All the pieces are essentially here. Now we just need to figure out these cross members so you have a place to set your feet, and it also supports the legs so nothing like racks or breaks or rocks. So Jess had a more complex design than I anticipated, so this piece I messed up earlier will be perfect for the cross member. So I'm going to cut 4 cross members on the CNC because it needs to be coved, and I can do it in 20 minutes with the CNC, and it would just take a lot of brain power to cut them by hand.
I think these took about 10-15 minutes to cut. I already had most of this stuff drawn in 3D as I made the design earlier in SketchUp to get all the angles and everything correct.
So 5 perfect pieces. I actually got to cut an extra one, so I'm gonna go cut these on the bandsaw. And the reason I wasn't cutting all the way through is my bit's not long enough, and I don't want to, so yeah. So now that we have all the pieces cut, I got to go through and add tapers to all the legs, make sure all the legs are the same exact height, and then just kind of piece together all this and figure out all the little tiny details.
Then this 90-tooth Diablo is going to add the most perfect taper. I should have added a little more of a taper, as Jess suggested, but we're not going to tell her she was right. As there's variance in both metal bases, I had to fit each side to each base separately. And then I used this same exact cove as I did for the front pieces for the cross members, and then just rip them down into the proper size strips. Then there was this little smidge hanging off the bottom side, so we're just going to zip that off over on the table saw. Then I just left that ever so proud, and we'll blend that when it's all glued together. And now to kind of get these all to where I think they should go. And since I don't want to spend the next 4 weeks cutting mortise and tenons by hand, we're going to use the domino. And I'm sorry if you don't have one. You can use dowels. That is okay. But if you do have a domino, I highly recommend these domino docks from Roman Artful. These things are great for these small weird pieces. And then we just did a quick dry fit to make sure these all fit together how they should with these loose tenons. Then we're just going to smother this in some liquid gold to tie this thing together. And getting these to all seat properly and line up perfect was a lot harder than anticipated. Definitely one of the harder aspects of getting the legs to fit. Getting them to fit in there wasn't bad at all, but getting the edge to line up perfect with the steel was harder than I thought. And then to give them a quick little touch up before final glue up. And glue ups like this can be pretty stressful. You just kind of keep calm, plan ahead, and just do the best you can, because you kind of race in the glue, but in the same sense you don't want to rush it and put any pieces in the wrong spot, which is why you label everything. I barely tapped these frames on there, and man, they were tight. I probably didn't even need the set screws to hold them in place. And now onto the chair backs. We added a slight taper to the chair backs to kind of thin them out a little bit so they didn't look so thick and chunky. And I still don't know how I feel about this next step. I chose to attach these with screws and plugs. I wish I would have done a more complex design, but in my mind it just seems like a quick, easy solution and it wouldn't be that visible, which it's not in the end, but I just don't like the thought of using screws. And back on the topic of inconsistencies, we're just going to trim these off so they appear to be the same height. Then I'm just transferring over the screw location so they're in the exact same spot on this other chair as they'll be back to back. And now to add a little bit of shape to these seat bottoms. And to ensure these are as close to the same size as possible, I'll use the first one as a template. And then to attach them, we're going to use threaded inserts and some bolts. And right about here is when I start getting pretty nervous.
Alright, I got it. I had it. I put it on the wrong one. It was like, the one back bolt was like a 16th off, but it fit on this one. All right.
And after a quick group meeting with the boss, we decided we still didn't like the shape of the seats, so we added a nice little taper on each edge. And obviously I re-rounded the corners. Then I added a steep chamfer with this router bit to the underside of both seats. Then I gave a quick zing-zing with the 1/4 inch roundover to match the shape of the steel frame around the entire surface. And time to tear these things apart to put the finishing touches on them and add some finish. Got this plug cutter on Amazon. Would not recommend. It's stated tapered plug cutter. For as hard as these things went in, I don't think they were very tapered. Should have just used the domino. This is definitely the saving grace of using the plugs, because it is awfully satisfying to cut these babies off. Wait till you see that chisel work. Ooh. Even though the shot's out of focus. Then I gave everything a quick sanding to 150, along with labeled everything so I knew what went together, because I don't think it would have went back together if it was the wrong piece. And this just goes to show how tight these things actually went on. Now, personally, I would have used a hard wax finish like Rubio or Osmo, or maybe even a tung oil, but the boss lady won. She said she wanted a nice, durable, ambering poly. I have multiple videos on my spray setup and how I spray. If you're interested, check those out. But pretty much 3 to 4, maybe 5 coats, sanding in between, and just spray enough on there so it doesn't drip. Especially these vertical surfaces, they can be a little tricky. And onto the skelly frames. Just give them a quick sanding and clean up with acetone, and then I'm just going to put 2 coats of self-etching primer along with some satin black spray paint. Ideally, you get these things powder coated, but you didn't have time for all that. And now for the most stressful part, getting these things all together without digging the paint or the finish on the frames. I let these set for about 3 days before I attempted to put these together. And I had to press them together. I got them on about halfway before they kind of stuck. And then I used the spacers to clamp them to the frame so I wouldn't ding up the paint. And then we just use cloths on the bottom of the clamps to hopefully not scratch the finish. And then just even pressure all the way around and they seated nicely. And then I just set the spacers on there and used the screws to attach the seat, and everything went together smoothly. The first one went together a little more tight than the second one. The second one went together way easier than the first one. It's probably the second one I welded. If I were to make these again, I would have just made a jig for the welding. It would have made this way easier, and I knew they would have been identical. And then just to add the screws to finish everything off so it stays together nice and tight. Not like they're going to fall off anyway, but I added the holes, so I might as well use them. Overall, we're super happy with how these turned out. Things I would have done differently is I would have found a different attachment method for the backrest, and then tapered the legs a little more to thin them out so they don't look as chunky. Let us know what you guys would have done different, what you think, and thanks for watching the video. And also thanks to Home Depot for sponsoring this video. Go buy some Diablo tools. The blades are great, along with the sandpaper.